Good morning and welcome back to the Share Series Monday Management Update. I'm Jenny Coben, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Greg Duncan, Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board of Virios Therapeutics, ticker symbol VIRI. If you would like to submit a question this morning, please use the question button at the top of the video player. Let's go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Jenny, for the warm welcome. And thank you all listening today for your interest in learning more about Virios Therapeutics' very innovative pipeline of therapeutics. Briefly summarized, we are focusing on a very novel mechanism of action, which is viral inhibition to deliver clinical benefits for patients who have chronic diseases. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. By way of background, I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Virios Therapeutics. I've been in the industry for about 30 years. About 20 of those years were with Pfizer in various commercial roles. I had the good fortune of launching a number of blockbuster drugs for Pfizer. I ran their UK operations and was actually running Pfizer's Latina business when I got recruited into UCB. UCB is a Belgian-based specialty pharma company. I spent 6 years there, the last 3 of which I was an executive committee member. And then about a decade ago, I jumped into the development side of the business. I'm very pleased to tell you I joined Virios in April of 2020 as a Chief Executive Officer. We listed the company in December of 2020, and I'm very pleased to tell you we are poised to move 2 key assets, IMC-1 and IMC-2, into clinical development, into phase 3 development for fibromyalgia, and into phase 2 development for long COVID. By way of background and to provide some context for the question and answer session, I thought I might provide a very brief overview of the Virios Therapeutics value proposition. As I mentioned, we're focused on viral inhibition. It may come as a great surprise to some of you on the call today to know that all of us are actually infected with literally hundreds of thousands of viruses. The herpes virus family is the most prominent of those viruses. And we believe that when those viruses infect you and go from a dormant state to an active state, that triggers an overheated immune response, and both the viral replication and the immune response can contribute to things like pain, fatigue, brain fog, concentration issues that are associated with these particular diseases, and we believe is actually triggered by viral activation. And the thesis for the company is to take those activated viruses back into a dormant state to deliver clinical benefits. Next slide, please. We'll be making forward-looking statements through the course of today's presentation. You can look on the SEC website or on EDGAR for more detailed information as presented today. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, we believe inhibition of viruses can deliver clinical benefits for patients. To give you a sense of the science that underpins our portfolio, I thought I might present a brief scientific slide, which may look complicated, but is actually a very simplified version of what these antiviral therapies are designed to do. Latent herpes viruses love dormant nerve cells, love to lie dormant in nerve cells throughout the body. Some form of stress triggers that virus. It could be anxiety, it could be a secondary health challenge. And when viruses get stressed, they begin to replicate. In a very Darwinian way, they create more copies of themselves. We believe that viral replication and the subsequent immune response is actually triggering different symptoms in patients. And our simple but elegant approach here is to combine either famciclovir or valciclovir with celecoxib to inhibit viral replication and to allow the immune system to reset and deliver clinical benefits for patients. Why did we select these 2 therapies? Well, famciclovir or valciclovir actually address viral replication by inhibiting the DNA that's required for viral replication. That part of the therapy is focused specifically on the virus. What is less well known, but very well documented in the medical literature, is that celecoxib, a COX-2 inhibitor that you may be familiar with, Celebrex is the brand name, is actually a key ingredient in this combination. And why do I say that? Well, through the medical literature, we know that celecoxib's target, COX-2, cyclooxygenase 2, actually serves as an amplifier or turbo booster, if you will, for viral replication. So what happens is the virus gets stressed, it creates more copies of itself, and by administering either famciclovir or valciclovir with celecoxib, we address the virus, we turn off the turbo booster, we inhibit the viral replication, we allow the immune system to reset, and we deliver clinical benefits for patients. Next slide, please. As evidence of those clinical benefits, we've seen that in multiple trials, both IMC-1 and IMC-2 deliver consistent efficacy across multiple clinical studies and a variety of endpoints. I won't go through all of the details of the information you see on slide number 4, but suffice it to say that whether we're looking at pain, which is a key hallmark symptom of fibromyalgia, fatigue, which is a symptom of both fibromyalgia and long COVID, or general patient global health through the PGIC measure, you can see clinically and statistically significant improvements in health, both at the symptom level and at the total health level, which gives us great confidence in moving these assets forward to treat patients with these very debilitating diseases. Next slide, please. So, unique mechanism of action supported by data from clinical trials, and I'm pleased to tell you that we are now poised with 2 clinical stage assets. IMC-1, which is a combination of famciclovir and celecoxib, is targeting fibromyalgia. We've executed a successful phase 2A study. We know from our phase 2B study exactly which patients will respond best with a fibromyalgia diagnosis to our therapy, and we're aligned with FDA on the required next steps to enter phase 3. We'll be enriching this particular trial to focus on new patients. These are patients who have not participated in prior clinical research. And our key efficacy readout is projected for mid-2020 for the very first of the 2 phase 3 studies we're presenting. Those studies will be preceded, by a pharmacokinetic study, which we hope to start towards the end of this year, with a subsequent goal of top-line data in mid-2025 for that study. Our second program, IMC-2, is a combination of valciclovir and celecoxib targeting long COVID. We've just completed a successful proof of concept study this year. In an open label study, we showed that IMC-2, or a combination of valciclovir and celecoxib, more specifically, showed very substantial clinical benefits, statistically significant benefits in reducing fatigue and other symptoms associated with long COVID. We are now starting to ramp up a 3-arm confirmatory phase 2 trial at the same center that conducted the proof of concept trial under double-blind placebo-controlled conditions, and we expect top-line data from this confirmatory study in the middle of next year. We'll be executing a pre-IND meeting with FDA later this year to align on regulatory requirements for a long COVID indication. You may know that there's really nothing approved at present for long COVID, so this could be a true game changer for the 10% of patients who get COVID who go on to develop long COVID over time. And I'm very pleased to tell you that we filed new method of use intellectual property protection on this combination for the treatment of long COVID, which, if granted, will provide us coverage to 2043. So that concludes a very brief summary of both my background, as requested, Jenny, and an overview of the company to provide some context for the Q&A. I suggest we conclude the presentation now and open up to the live questions.
Thanks, Greg. And I'd just like to remind everybody that you can refresh your screen so again, you can use the question button up at the top of the panel to send in a question. So Greg, you did a great job summarizing your program and your pipelines. Can you talk a little bit about the patient treatment journey for fibromyalgia and why there is a new need for treatment with several approved products already being used today?
Sure. So it may surprise you to know that there are, based on epidemiologic data, hundreds of millions of patients with fibromyalgia. And at present, here in the US, for example, there's only 3 approved medications. And all 3 of these medications were approved by the FDA over a decade ago. We as a team are very familiar with this category. Between myself, Mike Jenner, our chief medical officer, and one of our board directors, we've been involved in either the development or the commercialization of 2 of those 3 approved drugs. And so we know the space well. And what I can tell you is this. The vast majority of patients out in the marketplace that try these therapies get some benefit, but a very significant portion of them actually can't tolerate the side effects of the 3 approved medications. And as a consequence, for example, here in the US, there's roughly 3 million people diagnosed with fibromyalgia, but there's only 2 million treated at present, because we believe roughly 1.5 million of those patients, about 40%, have actually cycled off the therapy, not because they don't work, they're actually effective treatments, but because mechanistically they actually target the central nervous system. They come with untoward side effects for a goodly number of patients. Of those 2 million patients, roughly half are on Lyrica, or I should say 40% are on Lyrica, 40% are on Cymbalta, and the remaining 20% are actually on Savella. So There is a very significant opportunity here for IMC-1, either as a complement to those therapies, given it's a very different mechanism, to complement the therapy with Lyrica, Cymbalta, or Sebela, or to be used as the monotherapy for those 1.6 million of the 3 million who are not on a therapy as their potential baseline therapy. So a very significant opportunity exists in today's fibromyalgia marketplace because there's very significant dissatisfaction. I will tell you from my past, in diseases like depression or erectile dysfunction or hypercholesterolemia, there is an existing marketplace. And once you establish yourself as a drug of choice or one of the leaders in the category, with a healthy business profile, you can then begin to educate and accelerate the diagnosis between patient and provider to increase the number of patients who are actually diagnosed, because we do know, well, there's 3 million people diagnosed here in the US with fibromyalgia. The National Fibromyalgia Association estimates there's actually 10 million patients who fit the criteria. So there's 2/3 of the patients who are not even in the marketplace as yet. So our goal will be to address the dissatisfaction with the current therapies and then build over time to enhance the diagnostic rates in the marketplace, to grow the marketplace and hopefully grow the commercial opportunity for IMC-1, presuming continued success in phase 3.
Okay. And can you talk some about the data that you have in your phase 2 data? And also, one of the questions that we've got sent in is talking a little bit more about the target population that you're going to be looking at in phase 3.
Great. So happy to do so. So we have 2 phase 2 trials we've run for IMC-1. That's famciclovir and celecoxib, focused on fibromyalgia. The first trial was successful. That led us to progress into the second trial, the phase 2B trial, which read out roughly a year ago from today's Share Series conference. What we found in the phase 2B trial is that there was a mix of patients. There were patients who were new to research. These are patients who had not participated in prior fibromyalgia research. And then we had patients that were what I would describe as former clinical trial participants, older patients or experienced patients, if you will. In our original prognostications for running the trial for the phase 2B, we estimated that roughly 10% or so of the patients in the trial would be those experienced patients. So roughly 90% would be patients who are new to the category, new to research. They may have been diagnosed previously, but they had effectively never really participated in the clinical trial. What we found in the actual execution of the trial during the COVID pandemic was that we had the majority of patients, roughly 240 patients, who were experienced patients versus 150 or so, 175 patients that were new to the category. What we know about prior research, and we've seen this in other categories, is the patients that go from trial to trial to trial, by definition, are not getting response to therapy. So as a consequence, they become more refractory over time. We saw this back when I launched Zoloft, when we were researching depression patients. We've seen this in other categories as well. And what we think is happening over time is this more refractory group of patients, who is actually the vast minority of patients in the overall commercial opportunity, is probably less than 1% of patients, do not respond in a manner that's consistent with what you see with new patients. They respond differently, either less drug effect or more placebo effect, because the primary effectiveness they get is through interaction with their healthcare provider. And so the beauty of the phase 2B trial is that if you look specifically at those new patients, we had a very robust effect, very consistent with the phase 2A effect. We know exactly what the effect size is, and we know exactly what dose we need now moving into phase 3. And so in the phase 3 program, we'll be targeting just those new patients. And the way we do that is we screen out patients who've participated in clinical trials in fibromyalgia over the last 5 or 6 years or so. So we're focusing specifically on new patients. And if I could go back into history and explain a little bit about why we're really excited about this, if you look back to when Lyrica was originally studied, when Cymbalta was originally studied, and when Sebela was originally studied, all 3 of those drugs, all patients were new. There weren't enough research studies ongoing such that these patients who didn't respond from one trial could cycle through 6 or 7 other trials. Unfortunately, for these patients, drugs don't seem to be the answer. We don't know exactly what the answer is for these patients, but specifically for our trial, we'll focus on those new patients because we think the benefit there will be as robust as we saw in the phase 2A, and that gives us great excitement about moving into the phase 3 program.
Okay, excellent. So what are the next steps in this program? Right.
So we are presently exploring partnership and or financing, or likely a combination of the two, to execute on the fibromyalgia program. Those discussions are ongoing at present. The phase 3 alignment we have with FDA is we will execute a pharmacokinetic and food effect study with the new prototypes, the new dosage formulations that we'll be using for commercial scale-up. That study will precede execution of 2 acute phase 3 studies. Both are roughly 12 to 14 weeks in nature, where we're comparing IMC-1 and placebo in one trial, and IMC-1 versus placebo, and then the individual components of famciclovir and celecoxib, so a four-arm study in the second trial. The first head-to-head trial we hope to start execution on sometime, call it Q2, certainly mid-2024, with a readout in the middle of 2025. If that trial is successful, we'll then commence the second trial, the four-arm trial, and patients from both trials will have the opportunity to roll into a safety trial, the third component of the phase 3 program, to measure long-term safety as part of the NDA requirements. So effectively, PK study, head-to-head study, multifactorial study, and safety studies in sequence, and concurrently, frankly, with the safety study over the last couple months, all of which is designed to put together an NDA, if successful, sometime towards the end of 2026 or the first half of 2027.
Excellent. So, in following up on one of the things you just said, and this was a question that was sent in as well, can you talk a little bit about partnering this program and kind of what would that look like in an ideal world?
So in a perfect world, we can find a partner to help us both execute and fund the trials. In a absolutely perfect world, that would not require additional capital scaling, but we think some form of modest capital scaling plus a partnership would be ideal. That partnership could take on the variety of a global partnership, so a co-promote, if you will, across the globe, all territories. Or specifically, what we can do is put together some form of regional deal where Virios keeps access and rights to the US, but we farm out, license out territory rights for Europe and the emerging markets, Asia and specifics. Australia, Japan, and China have decent sized fibromyalgia marketplace, as does South Korea for that matter. And so we could execute some form of regional deal as well. What I would see there is some form of upfront co-development, sharing of costs, and then we can figure out exactly how the territory and royalty alignment splits out over time. Those are the considerations that we're baking into the ongoing discussions. We'll report back out once we have material feedback, one way or the other, on executing partnership and the financing in the near to midterm. Hopefully we have feedback as we crest into 2024.
Let's move on to long COVID. Talk about the opportunity, just broadly speaking, and kind of the feedback that you've gotten from Bateman Horne in terms of what the opportunity for this program is.
Yeah, it's funny. If you go back, about a year ago, people were saying, hey, we're done with COVID and we're moving on. And I think we've all now learned that, first of all, we're not moving on from COVID. And second, epidemiology data suggests now through the Recover program funded by NIH and NHLBI that up to 10% of people that are infected acutely with the SARS-CoV-2 virus go on to develop long COVID symptoms. I myself am now familiar with several people who have long COVID symptoms. These symptoms include fatigue, concentration issues, anxiety, depression, and in fact, estimates suggest that somewhere between 1% and upwards of 2% of the workforce are actually suffering significant morbidity such that they're missing some, if not all, of work as a consequence. What we do know is that this virus is stacked on top of other viruses. The SARS-CoV-2 virus gets stacked on top of herpes 1, herpes 2, Epstein-Barr, herpes varicella, etc. And what we think is happening mechanistically is it's actually not the SARS virus that's triggering the long-term sequelae. When you add CoV-2 on top of herpes viruses, we think some form of herpes virus, the most notable bad actor is likely Epstein-Barr, which is a herpes virus. Many people don't know that, but Epstein-Barr is one of the viruses in the herpes virus family. We believe that Epstein-Barr is getting triggered and activated. And as a consequence, over time, it's the Epstein-Barr activations that leading to those long COVID symptoms. And why we believe that's the case is we've probably all heard of chronic fatigue syndrome. Less have heard of myalgic encephalitis, the more formal name for chronic fatigue syndrome. But it's pretty well established now that Epstein-Barr reactivation is the driver behind chronic fatigue syndrome. We now know it's the driver behind things like mono, all of which have symptoms of fatigue, long-term concentration issues that look strikingly like long COVID syndrome or sequelae. And so our plan with the Bateman Horne Center was to test valsiclovir and celecoxib in a single center trial sponsored by the Bateman Horne Center under an unrestricted investigational grant to assess that combination versus a controlled mass population. So no placebo per se, but we match patients based on age, gender, symptoms. And what we noted was very, very significant findings on reduction in fatigue and autonomic dysthymia. People don't know this, but you've probably all heard of orthostatic hypertension. You get up and you feel lightheaded and have to sit down, and there's significant consequences for those who fall over, particularly that can be upwards in age. And the symptoms of orthostatic hypotension appear to be very, very debilitating for these long COVID patients. And we saw that valsiclovir and celecoxib also statistically reduced levels of autonomic dysthymia, including orthostatic hypotension. So we're very excited about this mechanism to deliver a broad series of effects, because we also saw reductions in anxiety, depression, and improvement in overall global health. So the next step in the program now, and we funded this step, is to execute a confirmatory valsiclovir plus celecoxib study under double-blind, placebo-controlled conditions. So higher standard, if you will, to tease out the effects here. That program will start enrolling patients sometime in the next 30 days. We're going out for the site initiation visit next week with the clinical team. We hope to begin enrolling patients, as I mentioned, very shortly. And the goal will be to have top-line readout sometime in the first half of 2024. The beauty of this program is that we'll get those data at the same time we should have feedback, or shortly after we get feedback from FDA in our pre-IND meeting, to figure out exactly what trial is required, what endpoints we should use to garner a potential approval for this combination as a treatment for long COVID. And I suspect you know this, Jenny, but for those of you who don't know it, there's nothing approved right now to treat long COVID patients. So this could be a real game changer, as I referenced earlier in my comments. And what this second confirmatory trial is designed to do is both test the thesis under double-blind placebo-controlled conditions, but also give us the effect size required to ladder up to the sample size for the phase 3. We'll use those data to figure out how many patients we need to deliver a statistically significant effect in the next phase, which is phase 2B. That dose ranging study will plan following feedback from FDA.
Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about cash runway. And you guys had an announcement this morning on the ATM. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And then also you mentioned about the opportunity, potentially to access some non-dilutive funds from some of the funding that the government has provided for long COVID research. So maybe touch on both of those if you can.
Yeah, so we think, given current market conditions, based also on feedback through some of our shareholders, that the best use of the team's time is actually to focus on operational priorities. Getting the PK study ready to go, having the pre-IND meeting, executing on the confirmatory long COVID trial, and at the same time exploring partnership, frankly, not just for IMC-1, but potentially for IMC-2. So we closed down the ATM to remove that financing overhang, if you will, off of the share price. And we do have capital to get us into Q3 of next year. And so we will get through this planning. It'll allow us to give a fulsome run at the partnership and also garner the data from the confirmatory long COVID trial. So we've got capital to get through that time frame. I think that's quite important because that data could really be a game changer for Virios Therapeutics. I really believe that. And as I mentioned before, the IP we've just filed, if granted, gives us 10 years beyond what our current IP is. So it gives us time to actually execute a fulsome development program. So that's absolutely critical. So we're very excited about that, the focus on the operational priorities. We've got capital to get through August of next year, maybe September of next year at present. And we're running a very efficient model. Just for those of you who are fans of Virios Therapeutics, we're running this public entity basically with 4 full-time employees. So that allows us to focus most of our activities, certainly most of our cash, on value-generating activities like the science. for example.
So as we wrap up the session today, Greg, if you can just summarize some of the upcoming key value drivers for Virios investors should be looking out for.
Sure. So I'll start with the fibromyalgia program. We are exploring partnership as we speak. Hope to have feedback on those discussions over the course of the short to medium term. We're also getting ready to execute the PK study. We're exploring which vendors, CROs, et cetera, will help us run that study so that we're ready to go when we form some form of partnership and or financing. So we don't want to lose time once we close a deal. Presuming success, that'll allow us to move right into that required PK study as a precursor to the phase 3. At the same time, if all goes well, we would hope to run that PK study, submit it to FDA, get their formal nod to commence the first study, the head-to-head study I referenced earlier, sometime in the middle of 2024, with data expected on this groundbreaking phase 3 program in the middle of 2025. The long COVID program has an equally rich series of milestones. We hope to dose our first patient in this program sometime in the next 30 days or so. We are also working to request an FDA pre-IND meeting sometime before the end of this year. We hope we have written feedback by FDA sometime before we transit from 2023 into 2024. That will confirm the requirements, both the FDA's view on a long COVID indication, and then if so, what endpoints, what length of trial, and the data from the ongoing confirmatory trial will allow us to ladder up the powering calculations, the sample size, if you will, based on effect size to execute that particular program. We should have data from that program, hopefully as we get to no later than Q2 of next year. So that's a really nice, very significant clinical outcome study that will happen sometime in the next 9 months or so. So we're very excited about delivering on the long COVID program. In addition to exploring partnership for IMC-1 and fibromyalgia, there are also a number of companies, a more finite number, but a significant sample of companies that do have an interest in long COVID that we think could be potential partners. And back to your last question, maybe as a final bullet point, the other thing we'll be doing milestone-wise is we're going to be meeting with the NIH, or more specifically the NHLBI, to explore whether or not they would have an interest in funding the next trial, non-dilutive funding as part of the broader recovery program for the phase 2B trial, which with alignment from FDA could be a very significant value pivot point for Virios Therapeutics. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the rich stable of milestones for the balance of this year, for 2024, and then ending with the IMC-1 phase 3 study number 1 sometime in the middle of 2025.
That's very helpful. And thank you, Greg, for being here today. And thanks to everyone for participating in today's Share Series session. Make sure to mark your calendar for the next Monday management update, which will be on October 2nd. And now up next is Rubicon Technologies. Thanks and have a great day.